All right, we got Philip Rossman-Reich on the line here from Orlando Magic Daily. Going to chat some NBA with him. Philip, how's it going today, man?
It's going good. Still getting on West Coast time, so trying to get myself going here in the morning.
Yeah, you mentioned West Coast time with the Orlando Magic losing to Golden State last night by 10, 110-100. But I think it's a good starting point here is to go ahead and talk about your Magic, a team that you know inside and out, a team that you know very well. 8-6 to start the year. I'm not sure that you expected that type of start from a team that won just 29 games last season.
No, and especially with the schedule they had early on, and a lot of really good teams that they played at the beginning of the season, and just it was just very unexpected to see this team get out to such a hot start. And really, what was more surprising is that their offenses just looked so incredible. They've really taken some huge leaps offensively. A lot of players just look completely different than they did last year, and obviously internal improvement's the best way to get better. And so the Magic really just kind of got better by themselves, and now you didn't expect it to happen this suddenly, especially with the way last year went.
Well, one of the themes that we're going to talk about here on today's show is we're going to talk about sustainability with some of these surprise teams, and with Orlando being one of them, let's touch on that a little bit. They got off to a very hot start because they were shooting extremely well from beyond the arc. Is this a team that now kind of tumbles, or is there some level of sustainability to the level of play that they've had?
I do think the Magic are going to the way I've been phrasing it is regress to the mean. I mean, this team has been shooting so incredibly. I mean, I think they were shooting at one point, fairly recently, 40% from beyond the arc. They were just destroying everybody offensively. And so it definitely felt like this team was going to kind of fall back a little bit. It's just completely unavoidable that they were going to do that. And I think we're seeing that happen right now, actually. The Magic are in the midst of a stretch where they're playing 8 of 10 games on the road. They're 3 games into that stretch, and they're 1-2, and we're starting to see the team struggle to shoot a little bit more. Some of their flaws are kind of getting exposed a little bit. But I think overall, though, this is still a much better team. I don't think that going back to the mean means they're going to go back to a 29-win team that gets blown out by 30 every night. This team does feel a little bit different, and so they may not be a team that can maintain an 8-3 pace like they were a 7-3 pace like they were a few weeks ago. But this is probably a team that's going to hover around 500, and that'll put them squarely in the playoff race, which I think is exactly where they want to be.
Now, one of the things I want to ask you about, you mentioned them playing so many road games, and now they're down to 4-4 on the road. They are 4-2 at home. Is this a variance thing in terms of their three-point shooting, or does it have something to do with better shot selection, which could continue to be a positive factor at home with a familiar shooting backdrop?
What's really interesting is the Magic actually shoot more threes and shoot better from 3 on the road statistically. Whether that lasts or not, I don't know. But I actually think at home you see less of the three-point shooting, and the Magic are a lot more comfortable attacking the basket there. It's still early to say that there is some variance, but of course, young teams tend to play better, more aggressive at home than they do on the road. So it does make a little bit of sense that is happening, that there is a perception that that's happening, but probably a little too early in the season to make conclusions. I mean, it's, we're 14, 15 games into the year. So a long, long way to go still.
All right, let's talk about one of the biggest surprises here, and maybe we can call this an overachiever. I don't know. We'll sort of talk our way through that. The Detroit Pistons, they are 10-3 on the year so far, 7-1 in their new digs at Little Caesars Arena. So clearly they like the home cooking there, although I'm not a huge fan of the Little Caesars pizza. But this is a team that's gotten off to a phenomenal start at home. Is this a thing? I mean, is this a team that could very well make the playoffs, or are they going to see the balloon burst very soon?
Well, I think Detroit is making the leap that we all thought they were going to make last year. I mean, remember 2 years ago they were in the playoffs. They gave Cleveland all they could handle in a 4-game series before they were swept. But each of those games was very, very close, and everyone kind of pegged Detroit last year as a team that was going to be on the rise. They suffered a lot of injuries last year. They never really got themselves going, and there were reportedly some infighting going on with that team, and they just fell flat. They just couldn't get themselves back into the playoffs. They added some good pieces this year. Avery Bradley, I think, has been a really, really big help for them defensively. Andre Drummond has come back refocused. Reggie Jackson looks a little bit healthier. And so now we're seeing their talent come through again. We're seeing that team that we thought was going to be a player in the Eastern Conference last year or grow into a player in the Eastern Conference last year. And so we're seeing, I think we're finally seeing them realize that potential. And so it's surprising how quickly it's come for Detroit and how they've been able to maintain their spot atop the Eastern Conference or near the top of the Eastern Conference. But it's not so surprising to see Detroit back into the playoff mix. They just needed to get their chemistry right, and right now they have it.
So I think the question then at this point becomes, how far does this drop go? I mean, this is not a team that's going to win 77% of its games the rest of the way. There's no doubt about that. But perception means everything here in the NBA betting market, and that is something that's very important and a point I want to drive home to our listeners here, is that you run into a lot of recency bias when it comes to the NBA. If it is a game, it is a league of streaks too. I mean, you have teams that'll lose 4 straight, win 4 straight, that type of thing. Just the nature of the beast for whatever reason. So for Detroit, they're going to fall off. But the question is, how far will they do it? I mean, is this a team that winds up in the 45 win range? Is it a team that regresses all the way back to 500 like the Magic? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure where they end up because they had so many problems last year. If they hit that losing streak rut, do they revert back to that? Do they fall back into those habits? I mean, I'm looking at their stats right now. They've played 8 of their 13 games at home, so they've gone out west and they played very, very well out west. But they played a lot of home games so far, and that's an easy way to establish your base and establish some confidence. We'll see how much that lasts. I mean, I agree. I don't think they'll stay at a 769 win percentage. I don't think they'll be, a team that's winning, 60 games or something. But they could certainly flirt. They could. I would say their ceiling's probably around 50 wins, and they could. I don't see them being much worse than a 500 team. So they're gonna regress to their mean. But again, with how tight the Eastern Conference is looking and how tight it's probably going to be, they'll be in that playoff race around the 40, 41, 40. They should be comfortably in if they're around 42, 43 wins, making the playoffs. But they'll be involved in that and probably win mid-40s. I would think.
All right, let's talk about some really bad teams here, because a lot of times in the NBA, you can find some value on some bad teams from an against the spread standpoint, just because they are so bad, and we've got several of them here this year, and they are very clear who they are. But we'll start with the worst team in the NBA right now, tied for the worst team in the NBA. That's the Atlanta Hawks, a team that you know very well, being in the Southeast Division there. 2-12 start to the year for the Hawks. They haven't won a game at home. They're 0-4 at home, 2-8 on the road. So to be fair to them, they haven't played a whole lot of home games here, but this is a very, very bad basketball team. How bad are they? They're going to struggle. There's no doubt about it. You lose so much that they did this summer. I think Dennis Schroeder is still getting used to his role as the main guy, and I got a role that he really wanted. But this Hawks team just doesn't have the talent, doesn't have the overall talent. They just lost so much this summer, and they don't really have they're not going to have the ability to win night in, night out. Now, having said that, watching them just a little bit, Mike Budenholzer is a fantastic coach. He runs a great system, and the Hawks are still going to challenge teams. So I mean, I don't know what their average margin of defeat is. They're going to get beat plenty of times, but it's always going to be that one game where their system just bugs another team. I mean, that's what you kind of see with some of these bad teams. Chicago's another team like that, where they don't have a lot of talent, but they're scrappy. They play really, really hard, and they come at you. And if you take them too lightly, they'll nip you in the butt. Because that's kind of what these bad teams have to do. You just with a team like Atlanta and a team like Chicago, they just gotta hope that they can stay in the game long enough to make it interesting at the end. And most nights they're probably not going to do that, but they both have, at least with Budenholzer, the Hawks have a really good coach who's going to keep his game, he's going to keep his game plan strong. And if they execute it, they can still be a little dangerous. It's just not going to happen every night. Yeah, the Hawks with a nice cover last night. They're actually 6-7-1 now against the spread, depending on the closing number you've got. In last night's game against New Orleans, they lost by a point. New Orleans came into that game at 9-4 against the spread, so they had been one of the better bets in the NBA. And I think that's something that kind of merits a little bit of consideration here, Philip, is that in the NBA, we talk about the schedule. I know there have been some more off days incorporated into the schedule to help these teams out. I still think we're seeing the same number of 3-4s and 4-6s. We're just seeing more off days when teams get back home or right before they take on a big road trip. So the situational elements are still out there. And that's the thing is with the bottom tier so clearly defined early on with the Hawks, with the Bulls, and the Mavericks, who we'll talk about here in a couple of minutes, and also the Sacramento Kings. These are teams that can cover spreads and can be competitive just because they get overlooked based on the daily nature of the NBA.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's easy to kind of look at a team's record and say, oh, this is not how it's going to, this game's going to end up this way. And while the league has done a really good job to decrease back-to-backs and get rid of 4 and 6s, I mean, you can see in plenty of instances where the schedule just gets you. I mean, every year teams have 2 or 3 what I call schedule losses, and then what a lot of people call schedule losses, where you just look at the schedule and you're like, there's no way this team's going to be up for that game. I mean, I know, I'll just use one example. In March, the Magic go on like a 5-game road trip. They play at San Antonio on the last day of that road trip and then play back-to-back at home against Milwaukee. If you find that game in March, it's going to be really tough for the Magic to win that home game against Milwaukee coming off a back-to-back off of a road trip. I don't think, I mean, there's a little bit of time between the last game of the West Coast trip and the game in San Antonio. But I doubt the Magic are going to be able to get home to get some rest before then, and even then you're flying back out to San Antonio. So the schedule still has its quirks, and if you're betting and if you're looking at it, you definitely want to consider whether a team is coming off a day of rest, whether a team is playing on a back-to-back, because those are fewer now. And so the teams that do get rest, I think, do have a little bit more of an advantage when they do play a team that's a little more tired.
All right, so the Dallas Mavericks, they're 2-12 as well, tied for the worst record in the league with the Atlanta Hawks. They take on the San Antonio Spurs tonight. Dallas catching 6 or 6.5 at home, depending on where you look. This has to be hell for Rick Carlisle and also Mark Cuban, obviously, but especially Carlisle and the situation here in Dallas, where this is a team that has had so much success over the last several years, and then now it's just been a long, sustained down period. Does this get worse before it gets better for this team?
I think this year they recognize it would probably be very bad. I don't think they probably didn't think it would be this bad because they have veteran guys like Wes Matthews and Harrison Barnes and, of course, Dirk Nowitzki. But that team they just don't have a lot of depth, and they're relying very heavily on their rookie, Dennis Smith Jr., who's been very, very good. But that is a team that they just don't have the chemistry and the pieces together to really make a push. I mean, Rick Carlisle is a fantastic coach. If anyone can figure out how to get things to work, it's him. But you got a Nerlens Noel situation, which isn't sustainable for either player or team. And you got a lot of young guys coming off the bench, playing with some veterans who, just don't mesh well together for whatever reason. Dallas is still a dangerous team. I mean, you got to watch out for some of their guys, but they're eminently beatable because of their lack of depth, because they just don't have a lot of players outside of their, kind of their big four with Barnes and Smith and Matthews, and then Dirk Nowitzki, who's kind of going through a retirement tour right now, if you want to call it that. And so Dallas just hasn't been able to get itself going, and I don't think that's going to, they'll probably go through a winning streak and kind of climb their way out of the cellar with, Sacramento and Phoenix there. But I don't know if it's going to get much better.
All right, so let me ask you about this, Philip. We got a lot of teams out there that are hovering within a game or two of 500, and that's not really a big surprise. Everybody trying to get back into the rhythm of the season. Are there any 500 teams out there that you think are going to really start to separate themselves from the pack and maybe start to move up the standings a little bit?
Well, there are two that I think that we should always keep an eye on, and that's Oklahoma City at 6-7 and Cleveland at 7-7. I think those two teams are going to figure things out, and they're going to win games. There's just too much talent on those teams, and you trust that they know how to manage a regular season and know how to kind of push themselves through some of these struggles. So I do suspect that both of those will take their next step, or will take a step forward, at some point this season. I just don't think that that's avoidable. I mean, they're both very, very, very good. Another team that's at 500 that I think we're going to see figure things out, Milwaukee at 7-6, I think is going to probably figure things out and start winning some games. And then in the Western Conference, Denver's starting to figure things out at 8-6, and they're starting to push themselves forward. So, it seems like a lot of the teams that are at 500 that you wouldn't expect to be at 500 are those veteran teams that will figure it out. I mean, teams like Orlando, teams like New York, teams like New Orleans, you don't trust those teams to kind of maintain that pace. And so those are the teams that I would expect to fall back a little bit as the better teams begin to assert themselves. I mean, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so the guys that got out to a fast start, some of them can't maintain that pace. Others stay back in the pack. They'll make their move at the 10-mile mark or the 15-mile mark or whatever it is. And so the standings, don't look so normal quite yet. It's still early in the season, but within the next month and a half, I'm sure we'll get a better sense of which teams are actually for real.
Well, of course, the challenging thing for bettors out there is that the Cavs and the Thunder are both priced like the high upside, high ceiling teams that they are, and they just haven't gone out there and covered a whole lot of numbers because they just haven't gotten things squared away yet. And, of course, for the Cavaliers, I mean, it's been very clear in their 14 games. When they've wanted to play, when they've played teams that they've wanted to go up against, the Bucks, the Celtics, the Bulls, that they just have that rivalry with the Bulls, beat the Knicks last night. When they've played teams they've wanted to play, they've mostly shown up. When they've played games that they don't care too much about, that's when they've lost and looked bad in the process. So I certainly wouldn't worry about the Cavs at all. Last thing I'll ask about here, Philip, in terms of those teams that are kind of in the middle of the pack right now, any that you feel like are overachieving a little bit here that maybe aren't as good as 500 teams?
Well, I think Orlando and New York are really good examples of teams that are probably overachieving a little bit. I mean, Kristaps Porzingis has played absolutely insane. I mean, even last night in the Cavs comeback against the Knicks, Cleveland had to put LeBron James on Porzingis to get him out of rhythm and kind of keep him from helping the Knicks maintain that lead, which is a rare move that you see in November at least. So the Knicks, I think, are playing a lot better than everyone expected, and Porzingis is a big reason for that. They're scrappier and they're better. Don't get me wrong; they're definitely a better team, but they're a team that I expect to fall off. Orlando is definitely a team I expect to fall off. Their hot shooting is starting to run out, and you're beginning to see some of their flaws. They're not a great rebounding team. They really rely on pushing the tempo, and so when they don't score, they struggle to get stops, and when they struggle to get stops, they struggle to get out in transition and score. So they're a team that I think is definitely due to fall a little bit in the Eastern Conference. And I think there are a few teams out west that might be due for a fall. But I think the West, the 9 teams that are going to be competing for the playoffs have really established themselves. Maybe the Clippers will climb back into that race at 5 and 8. So. There's definitely going to be a lot of changes to the standings at this early stage. We're far from done, and it's far from time to really look at the standings closely.
Philip Rossman-Reich from OrlandoMagicDaily.com. What's going on over there right now, man?
Yeah, right now we're dealing with the West Coast trip, so we're talking a lot about the Magic top start, trying to figure out whether this team is for real or not. Looking at early season trends and trying to figure out whether they can last, whether they'll stick to it. For the rest of the season. Like I said, it's a marathon, not a sprint, and the Magic got out to a fast start, and we're trying to see if they can keep up that pace.
Well, you can find Philip on Twitter with one of my favorite Twitter handles, @PhilR2. Philip Rossman-Reich, OrlandoMagicDaily.com. Thank you so much for joining us, man, and we'll talk to you again soon.
No problem. Thanks for having me on, as always.